right, welcome everyone to Alphabets, a exciting conversation where we look at mid-cap consumer-facing companies, where we try and discover the key drivers behind a business's success or failure. I'm your host, Nathan Warden, and with me today is Ross Klein, the CIO of ChangeBridge Capital, and Pat Connolly, our resident stock detective. Today, we're going to be talking about Grocery Outlet Go. Pat, what is this business and what do they do?
All right, so Grocery Outlet is a discount retailer and mostly a grocery store. They got 400 stores, but they're not operated by the company. They're operated by individual operators who have a lot of skin in the game. So essentially, Grocery Outlet doesn't have store managers. They have these operators who they sign up, they invest in the company, and they become the manager of the stores. The small stores, they kind of look like Trader Joe's, kind of a similar size, similar number of inventory items on the shelves, and people will refer to it as the TJ Maxx of grocery.
Perfect. All right, so the first thing that we want to talk about is getting my slides going. Here we go. So Ross, what is one of the most important things that we're going to be talking about today when it comes to Grocery Outlet?
Yeah, so a few things: store count, unit economics, and sort of long-term margins. It's a fairly straightforward business model. And so as analysts, we're able to reduce the number of variables and come up with a fairly simplistic, logical, and targeted economic model. And so we want to see what store count growth looks like, what the company thinks is reasonable, what their targets are long-term, what the margins are as they grow. And we can come up with a pretty reasonable estimate for what we think operating profit looks like in a few years based on those few inputs.
Great place to start. So store count, Pat, what does management think is realistic? And do you think that that's realistic? What do you have to say to us about store count?
10% a year doesn't sound like a lot, but once you start adding it up, it grows pretty quick. So it'll be 250 new stores in just 5 years. And so if you look at this map, you can kind of see where California, Washington, they can kind of fill in Oregon with their existing supply chain distribution. Doesn't seem like too much of a stretch. But then like Pennsylvania's on the other side of the country. So then you have to look at that. And they even got into Pennsylvania because they did an acquisition. So it's kind of not organic growth in Pennsylvania as it is, but they want to expand the model. So we'll see.
So is this kind of growth realistic for new locations?
I think so. I mean, I was trying to look at the warehouse to store ratio. So in California, it's the most densely populated store count, and they can do about 60 stores for a single warehouse. And Pennsylvania, they have 2 warehouses. And coincidentally, Pennsylvania has a lot of food deserts, which are kind of a problem in a lot of low-income areas, and it's a discount retailer. So I think that plays pretty nicely. So Pennsylvania would be a really good test to see if the business model can expand on its own, in my opinion.
Ross, when you look at this in management's projections, do you initially get the feeling that this is a realistic growth expansion rate for unit count on like a 5-year outlook?
I do. If we look at what other grocers have done when they were in that growth phase of their business model, they were growing at rates that exceeded this. It's not crazy. It's also not as capital intensive given the sort of owner-operator model that they're using. So, and the smaller footprint of a store versus like a Kroger or Albertsons. So that does seem doable as long as there's demand, right? So, that's the key variable here. The grocery world is shifting pretty quickly, which is not something you ever thought you would say. But, a lot of it is moving online. Instacart's growing incredibly fast. Amazon's doing it themselves. Walmart's starting to do it themselves. Some of the grocers are doing it themselves. So, it's a question of if demand is there, can they grow? And so far they've been able to do it despite growing at a pretty healthy clip for the last few years. They're putting up impressive same-store sales numbers, which means they haven't hit saturation yet in any of the states they're in.
So if demand is there, can they grow? Pat, looking at the next 5 years, what do the numbers tell us?
Yeah, so I was playing with the numbers a little bit. I kind of assumed if store count increases, depreciation is going to increase pretty heavily. So that kind of weigh down operating income. They've done some stock-based compensation, which I know people don't like. I kind of just penciled out a decent number on that. But yeah, you can see it, like if it grows a little bit, you can have a healthy EBITDA margin. I'm sure Ross has some thoughts on this, but I was being pretty aggressive in these numbers a little bit.
What sticks out to you here, Ross?
The DNA number. So I'm not sure that I would do depreciation as a year-over-year number. I would sort of look at it as a percent of revs, or as a percent of, I mean, you can actually calculate it if you try to figure out how much CapEx is going to go into building out a new store, and figure out how many years they're depreciating. You can actually come up with a real number there. I think this looks high, just eyeballing it. It's hard to imagine that depreciation grows faster than store count growth, unless there's something else going on, or they acquire an adjacent business. And if they acquired an adjacent business, I imagine they'd have stores, right? So that depreciation number looks a bit high. To have SG&A growing in line with revenue seems reasonable, but perhaps a bit conservative. And then on that revenue number, if we think they're going to grow unit count 10% a year, we have to assume, well, this number implies no same-store sales growth. And so I would, if we are optimistic about unit growth, we should probably be fairly optimistic about same-store sales growth as well. It's not a perfect correlation, but those would be the few things that stand out to me here, that sales growth might be understated, SG&A growth might be overstated, depreciation probably looks a bit overstated. And so that all tends to suggest a potentially higher operating margin than what's shown here.
So the operating margin that's shown here right now, if they were to achieve that, let's say Pat Connolly is 100% right and he has predicted the future and this is how it turns out, would this operating margin be really interesting to you?
No.
You would want to see it higher.
Yeah, I mean, because I can get this from another grocer. You know, this is a Kroger operating margin. And, you know, if we're looking at 10% sales growth on 0 comp, I can get that at Kroger with, you know, an 8% free cash flow yield. It's not as interesting to me. Now, if we're looking at 5% same-store sales growth and margins that are getting into the 7 to 8 to 9% range, and we're growing 15% a year, you know, and we're talking about a company that generates, you know, 400 million in EBITDA in a few years, and you put a 15 on that, then, you know, it starts to get a little bit more compelling.
What could drive same-store sales growth higher? Could e-commerce, we have this next slide about COVID impact and forcing management to consider e-commerce. Is e-commerce something that can push same-store sales growth higher?
You know, it's actually interesting. Normally when we talk about inflation, we talk about all the ways that it's bad for a large public company and obviously bad for consumer. But grocers tend to do better during inflationary periods. We just haven't had an inflationary period in a long time. And so having average selling prices go up is good for grocery comps. It doesn't necessarily improve gross margins per se, but a strong operator with an incentivized store level manager is probably able to utilize rising prices to the store's benefit. So that's actually one way that investors could approach Go with an eye towards protecting themselves in the event that inflation picks up. you're going to need your groceries almost regardless. And consumers tend to shift from branded to private label during periods of higher inflation. That's usually good for the grocer itself. So that would be one thing I would think about.
Was there a point you wanted to make about inflation protection or things like the pilot program with Instacart?
Yeah, the Instacart thing just started out. I know they're going to be adding about 200 units on it. It's mostly like fresh and organic stuff. They said it'll probably be a low single digits improvement to overall sales. So it's something.
Did they say anything about margins on Instacart?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
And I'm actually pretty curious about the two of you. From what I'm aware, delivery businesses like Instacart are really, they take up a lot of capital and they're very expensive for the consumer. Do either of you think that things like Instacart, DoorDash, Uber Eats, delivering food, are those things can actually help grocery stores like go out, or are they not here to stay super long?
Remains to be seen. I mean, if we look at the restaurant comp and ask ourselves, is delivery good for them? I'm in the camp that they don't know yet. And so far, I don't think it's great for, I mean, it's helped keep restaurants alive during COVID, but at what margin cost? You know, when DoorDash is taking 20% of the ticket and a restaurant usually has 20% operating margins, a highly successful restaurant, that is, you know, that's a really big cut. And so, not predicting the future, I don't know what happens next, but it's hard for me to imagine that grocers give up the same margin as restaurants, because the grocery market is not fragmented, whereas the restaurant market is highly fragmented. And so DoorDash has more negotiating power with an independent restaurant than it does with Albertsons or Kroger's.
That's a super interesting thought. Thanks for, I was just curious about that, so I wanted to touch on it real quick. All right, so grocery outlet, they're independently operated, each of these businesses. So Pat, I wanted to ask you, you know, what does that have to do? How does that position their business?
It aligns incentives properly, because the independent operators, they don't buy the groceries or the inventory themselves. Grocery outlet gives it to them on consignment, but any like leakage that comes out of the independent operator's pocket. So it's a really unique model where who's like making money, who's not making money. So I was trying to figure out like the economics of a single store. If you want to open up a store, like what kind of costs do you have to incur? Like what'd your profile look like? So like the net income of a store is your salary. Like you're the manager, that net income is your salary. They typically want like a married couple to be the operators, which is interesting. Like a couple that had like history in retail, and they kind of want to do their own thing. And so yeah, like some of these assumptions were, I guess a lot of people like to start up, they need a loan from grocery outlet, but they give them a loan at a pretty high rate, like 9%. So that's an interesting revenue source for the parent company. And then yeah, the operators have to absorb most of the costs, and then they just hopefully maximize the efficiency of the store, and it's all good.
This is a pretty interesting slide. So did you find this, or did you build this? Like, is this what Grocery Outlet is telling their potential independent operators, saying, hey, year one, you might make around 72,000. By year 5, you could be making 165,000. Is that one of their kind of ads that they're trying to get independent operators to start a grocery outlet store with?
No, that's what I wanted to see, but their information online is pretty terrible. So I was trying to figure out the average revenue of a store. And I figured day one of the store, you're not going to be at maximum customers. So like you're starting at 60% of what you could be, and it ramps up over time. And as they branch out in the community, spread the word and get community involved, the whole store can hopefully become a cash cow for them.
They should talk to you about marketing, because that's like a pretty, good way to say, here, join us. Pat or Ross, do these numbers seem realistic to you?
I'm just curious. First of all, Pat, this is great. And I have some questions on the model. for you. But how are we pulling gross profit?
So gross profit is split 50-50 with grocery outlet and the operator. So I assume so it's a store revenue minus the cost of employees. That's the store's gross profit. And then grocery outlet takes half of that. And then the independent operator has to subtract their own costs, like the utilities and the credit card fees and the leakage to get to their own gross profit.
What about the cost of food? Like the cost of goods sold? The 375 on a 4.5, like in year one, that seems like a very, very high gross profit margin for a grocer.
Yeah, all I did was subtract revenue from the employee costs to get to the store's gross profit.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll take another look at it. I'm not sure if these don't look like normal margins for a grocer off the bat, but stepping aside from that for a second, I'd be curious to think about because the EBITDA margin looks right.
Yeah.
You know what? There's a decimal place off. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay. Once we get down to EBITDA, this makes sense. There's a decimal place off. Okay. I'm curious what you think about this independent operator model. Does it enable them to be more of local experts, even though they're expanding nationally?
It should. There shouldn't be some top-down policy that adversely affects like each individual store. It's like each individual store has to make their own rules, their own HR policies, so they can kind of cater to the community and the employees. So it should be flexible.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, having described it as the TJ Maxx of grocers, it's a pretty apt comparison. You know, you go to a grocery outlet and it's sort of a treasure hunt. You know, you don't necessarily know what you're going to find, but you're probably going to find something at a good value. That's hard to replicate online. Not to say that it can't be done, but it makes for a tougher proposition to replicate online, I think, than the traditional grocery model.
Yeah, speaking of things that are advantages, competitive advantages, hard to copy, Pat, what are grocery outlets' competitive advantages?
So yeah, like Ross said, in economic times where their pockets gets pinched, they have to start looking for discounts, start taking the store brands, so that benefits them. The independent operators, they absorb these extra costs of wage inflation. And then this is like, I think personally, like having less items in the store is a benefit, as people tend to eat healthier. Like they're shopping less Oreos and cereals, or they just want their fresh veggies and, you know, meat and produce. So if you have a large store and people stop eating junk food, it's a lot of wasted space that might not get filled.
Yep. Any thoughts there, Ross, on competitive advantages?
I'm with Pat. Fewer SKUs is a good thing. Better inventory management, probably higher margins, lower overhead. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Cool. All right, and then the risks. What risks do we have, Pat?
Pretty concentrated in California. You know, they might not be as business friendly to the independent operator model. We saw the independent contractor thing kind of get people nervous in Uber. The franchise laws, this could be kind of construed as a franchise to some people who don't know. That's kind of how you look at it if you're going to be an investor in an independently owned store. So I think that's pretty, we could have a policy that come out and like the stock could be down 20% one day. Who knows? I don't even, like, I'm trying to figure out their supply chain, like where they get this inventory. Like, why is there so much inventory that like has to get disposed of? Like, if there's better manufacturer management, do they not have so much excess inventory? But like, apparently there's a lot of suppliers and that doesn't seem to be a huge risk for them. And then, yeah, just overall, just competitive landscape of just e-commerce taking over, like habits changing, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So coming down to the final what do we think? So coming down to it, things that I remember Ross saying, if the margin is a bit higher than the assumptions Pat was making, if e-commerce is going to be hard to replicate, what do we think of grocery outlet as a investment over the next 5 years? Is this something that we should be thinking about? I'll go.
Oh,
Question for Pat or Ross?
I'll go with Ross.
Yeah, so I mean, if Pat's estimates are right, I don't think it's that compelling. If you think it's a business that grows 15% a year for the next few years, you get to 4 billion in revenue in 3 years, put up a 7% margin, and you get high 200s in EBITDA with a pretty reasonable path forward. You could put a healthy multiple on that and have 12 to 15% annualized returns for the next few years on a somewhat low risk stock given its end market, with potential to benefit from some inflationary tailwinds. So I think it's potentially pretty compelling.
And then the idea though of Kroger is, if you're looking for protection from inflation, is something like Kroger going to be a better bet?
I think if you're looking for protection from inflation, but you don't expect to have rates go higher, you'd rather own the company that has better growth prospects. And I think that's Go rather than a Kroger, logically.
Yeah. Pat, any final comments here?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm like too obsessive about this food desert idea, because I know Dollar General has been pretty adamant of going into like rural areas, and like I know there's like a real problem of like local established grocers or like small family owned, where like their non-perishable sales just get killed by Dollar General. I don't know if that's a threat or not. If you've heard of that or not, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be. I have a hard time believing that Dollar General becomes a true grocer, but as they shift to more rural areas, you're right, it could be an incremental competitor.
Cool. All right. Thanks for your thoughts. That's a wrap for today. We'll be checking back in on Grocery Out in the future. Thanks for tuning in.